Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our conversation. As folks continue to join the Zoom, we invite you to let us know in the chat box where you're joining us from. Just some basic housekeeping. We'll be doing our best to keep the conversation to 1 hour. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of the hour and would love to hear from you all. Please type your questions for our panelists in the Q&A box and use the chat box for comments and reflections. Please understand that we try our best to answer as many questions as possible, as well as balance the time we have together. And just to note, we do have closed captioning available thanks to Karen Menk, who is coming to us to provide for us closed captioning. And with that, I would like to welcome National Now President Christian Nunes.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to Break the Cycle, a conversation about the rise of anti-APIA racist violence. I am now President Christian Nunes, and we are honored to host this conversation this evening. We will hear from distinguished panelists, and we will want to learn from their experiences, discover how we can support efforts in legislation to address this growing issue, and actions that we can take as allies and activists to help stop the rise of anti-APIA racist violence. Now, as we are all happy to gather here this evening with you, it is obvious we are also gathering with heavy hearts due to the horrific shootings that happened last night at 3 Atlantic area spas. 8 people were murdered, including 6 Asian women. And as Georgia State Senator Michelle Au stated, the horrific crime is taking place in a landscape where Asian Americans are increasingly terrified and fearful for their lives and their safety because of these escalating threats. Tragically, anti-Asian Pacific Islander American bias, discrimination, and hate crimes are nothing new. And according to the American Psychology Association, APIA community is often subject to a unique set of stereotypes, including the false portrayal of all Asian Americans are successful and well-adapted. These myths render a very diverse population invisible to discussions of racial bias in America. Politicians co-opted the so-called model minority stereotype to create a divide among racial minorities and to downplay the role of racism in American society's inequities. And essentially, absolving white systems from taking real accountability for racial inequities in the Asian APIA populations. Like other racial minorities, Asian Americans are also targets of regendered racism. Asian American men often are seen as effeminate or asexual, while Asian American women are viewed as sexually desirable, exotic, or passive. These stereotypes can follow Asian Americans into the workplace, limiting leadership opportunities. Research has shown that these stereotypes of Asians are as technically competent, diligent, and quiet persist, making Asians less likely to be promoted in management and leadership positions. And of course, long before we ever heard of COVID-19, we sadly saw violent hate crimes among the Asian American population, and vicious violent attacks, particularly with the South Asian population, where they were most likely fell victim to stereotypes because of regarding terrorism. But there is no denying that there has been a distinct rise in hate crimes and attacks since the start of COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic's impact has been devastating to people worldwide, with socioeconomic implications for many years to come. However, a more insidious side of the pandemic has been recklessness on the far-right extremists, including elected leaders attempting to scapegoat the API community. Hateful, bigoted rhetoric, and attempt to racialize the virus with terms we've heard of things such as the China virus and Wuhan flu have led to a dramatic increase in attacks on the APIAs since the pandemic started over a year ago. We are now starting to see a rise in media reports of heartbreaking attacks on elderly Asian populations, and a groundswell in celebrities and policymakers condemning the violence. A recent analysis released by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremists examined hate crimes in 16 of America's largest cities. And it revealed that while such crimes in 2020 decreased by 7%, those targeting Asian people rose by nearly 150%. I want you to hear that again. While overall hate crimes decreased by 7%, they rose for the Asian population by 150%. While certainly not the only factor research acknowledged was President Trump's welding the fact that the virus originated in China and repeated elevation of the China virus in his rhetoric did play a part in fostering that hate. There was also a surge in cities in New York, where anti-Asian hate crimes rose by a shocking 833%. Los Angeles and Boston also experienced notable rises. And of course, now we can see that there were similar surges in crimes and rises in hate crimes in Atlanta. And research notes that there is underreporting of acts is likely due to as first-generation immigrants tend to not report crimes at all. These statistics and other shocking events of yesterday are a wake-up call for all of us. And even as we are hopeful that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and at the end of this pandemic, we can all know that there is bias and hate and brutality against the API community, and it will not abate anytime soon. And we must, as allies, in any way that we can be today, be in solidarity with this community, but we have to start by listening. So today, it's my honor to welcome our now National Board Member and the Oregon Now State President, Christine Chin Ryan, who will go forward and introduce our wonderful panelists and speakers today. I bring forth Christine.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure to be here today for this vital conversation with activist leaders, legislators, and community members to learn how we can support efforts to address this issue and actions we can take to help stop the rise of anti-APIA racist violence. As Christian discussed, a shocking new report shows the dramatic increase in anti-APIA hate crimes in the last year. But these numbers don't even reflect recent crimes over the last few weeks and the tragic murders that occurred last night in Atlanta, where 6 of the 8 killed are women. Local advocates in Georgia have raised alarms regarding a recent string of attacks against Asian Americans in the state that included disgusting images and racist slurs, largely echoing the relentless scapegoating used by the former President Donald Trump and his administration during the course of the pandemic. There's no denying that what happened last night was fueled by white supremacy and deep-seated structural racism, and I know it has sent shockwaves throughout the country. The website Stop AAPI Hate received 3,800 reports of anti-Asian hate from March 2020 to February 2021, with 35% of discriminatory acts happening at businesses and with women reporting hate incidents twice as often as men. The fact is that the number of Asian Americans who feel unsafe in this country is rising. Of course, there's likely a link between anti-Asian rhetoric, recently heard in our public discourse in response to the coronavirus. But the issues are much more complex and long-standing than that. Today, we will dissect how those issues, including racial stereotypes, the pitting of racial groups against one another, the vast socioeconomic differences within the APIA communities, gender discrimination, and much more factor into every violent hate crime we've witnessed. We will also learn about very real action steps that we can take as activists and allies to move the needle forward and lift up the work being done by phenomenal APIA legislators, organizations, and activist leaders. We will now turn to our panelists. First, it is my pleasure to introduce Greg Orton, National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, or NCAPA. He leads the coalition in developing policy and communication strategy and advancing a joint agenda to address the needs of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. Previously, he worked on Capitol Hill for Representative Al Green, Democrat from Texas, where he has served as a dedicated advocate for the APIA community, as well as a mentor for many APIA staffers in Congress. Welcome, Greg. Next, I would like to introduce John Yang, President and Executive Director, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, or AAJC. John leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights through public policy advocacy, education, and litigation. In 1997, John co-founded the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center. He also served as president of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association and in the Obama administration as senior advisor for trade and strategic initiatives at the Department of Commerce. In light of yesterday's attacks on the Asian American community in Atlanta, John is getting a lot of requests for interviews, and he will be joining us a little later. It is now my pleasure to introduce Yulin Niu of the New York State Assembly 65th District. Yulin, by the way, I think you would be an excellent role model for the young APIA women and girls. In 2016, she was elected to serve the 65th Assembly District and is the first Asian American to represent Lower Manhattan and Chinatown. Previously, she also served as Chief of Staff for Assembly Member Ron Kim, where she led efforts to expand language access for immigrant communities. She's a longtime advocate around financial empowerment, especially in the areas of unbanked communities and affordable housing. She also co-founded New York State's first ever Asian Pacific American Legislative Task Force. Welcome, Yulin. My first question is for Greg. APIA has a robust policy platform to address hate crimes against the APIA community, including anti-hate crime legislation, police anti-bias training, and community outreach. Please tell us what initiatives are top priorities right now in light of the recent rise in hate crimes in this community.
Thanks, Christine, and hi, everybody. It's good to be with you. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that today has been a difficult day for all of us. And, honestly, it's just been a real challenge to navigate the last 36 hours, considering all that's happened. But as all of us know, anti-Asian racism isn't anything new. And it certainly didn't even start a year ago with the pandemic. It just happened to be highlighted with it. And so APIA, our member organizations, have been working hard to make sure that the Biden administration is hearing from the community all the different perspectives we have, and to make sure, and I think this is really important to emphasize, that there's this knee-jerk reaction to respond to these type of incidents or hate crimes with more law enforcement. And certainly we want to make sure that there's safety involved, but what has been missing a lot of times is a really community-centered approach, focusing on impacted people, understanding that when you're talking about Asian Americans, oftentimes they are not accessing government resources or engaging with the government. And so there's a feeling of isolation and a feeling as though no one is going to come to help. And so incidents like last night when, 8 people were murdered, 6 Asian American or Asian women were killed, it really reinforces that. And so I think we have to be honest with that in terms of the solutions we're pushing the administration to pursue. And so APIA, our member organizations, have been involved with engaging with the Office of Public Engagement at the White House, the Department of Justice, as well as the Domestic Policy Council. And that really is what we're trying to push, very much so, making sure that not only is there the right conversations happening between the community and the government, but also there has to be resources, because many of these communities have been under-resourced historically, and there has to be a real commitment by the government to bridge that gap if we're really going to find a solution to this problem.
Thank you, Greg. My next question is for Assemblywoman Niu. You speak often about the myth of the broken system and how, in actuality, the system is working exactly how it was designed, to hurt certain communities while allowing other communities to gain from that hurt. Could you please talk about how that plays a factor into the recent rise in hate crimes and how reforming all of our systems can create real change?
Thank you, Christine. And I'm really glad to be able to talk after Greg just did, because I think that he hit on so many of the points that we actually do need to talk about. And thank you for your perspective, because it is one of great importance. I think that, right now, I say it on repeat. I say it, on repeat that, it's not that we're falling through the cracks. It's not like, people are, just being missed by, some things and we could just do a little band-aid solution here or there. And this is not about, how, we have a broken system and we need to fix it. This is a system that is working exactly as it was designed. This is a system that we are seeing has perpetuated racism on um, all of the groups that have had state-sanctioned racism, built in, right? When we're talking about slavery, when we're talking about, the Chinese Exclusion Act, when we're talking about the Japanese internment, when we're talking about, from the very basics of like, the treaties that were signed to take away the lands and belonging of our tribes, and I think that, we have a very obvious system that has been written by the people who were in power and who are still in power, who don't want us to have access to that power. And so they will write it and design it the way that they are able to stay in power. So that's basically what it is. It was designed to benefit particular individuals while hurting so many of our communities, right? And you see it in our criminal justice system. You see it in how certain people can get benefits and certain people cannot. You see it in whether or not people are able to access their government, and you see it in who's elected and who's not, and who's represented and who's not, and who's ever at the table. Then they're the ones who get to rewrite the system or write the system exactly in their own image. And I think that that's why it's so important to make sure that we have representation, that we are able to change and redesign a system. We have to dismantle this one. It's not working. It's not fair. It's racist. It is not broken. It is designed this way. And, I think we need to rewrite a system that's designed in our own image, in an image of diversity and fairness and equity and transparency and accessibility. And I think that that is exactly what I'm trying to portray when I say that.
Thank you, Yulin. My next question is for both of you, Greg and Yulin. How does the model minority trope hurt the APIA community and contribute to some of the escalating tensions we are currently seeing?
Sure, I can take a crack at that. I mean, I think the Asian American identity has always been pulled between two ends of a pretty racist spectrum, like was mentioned before, right? On one end, we're the model minority that's killing it. We don't need help. We're fine. We should be an example to all communities of color of what success can look like if you just work hard enough. And then on the other end, it's the perpetual foreigner, right? Which is what we're seeing, throughout the pandemic, which is we're this foreign threat, the carrier of a virus that poses a health risk to the entire country. And I appreciate the points that the assembly member made earlier, because it is true. Like, this system is designed to put us in between those two spectrums, and then we're used as a wedge. And so the model minority stereotype has actually driven the community even further away from the mainstream conversation about the impact of COVID-19. Because again, there's assumptions that we're fine, right? Anti-Asian racism, it's just a thing, right? And no one was taking it seriously, even though community leaders all across the country were saying, look, this is happening in our backyards, and it's only a matter of time until things get worse. And we're here today. And I certainly wish that we weren't. But I think there's no question that this is an opportunity to push people to really re-examine how they view the community. And to say one more thing, I think it also starts with recognizing that when we say Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, or AAPI, we have to stop thinking about people who look like us, East Asians, right? There are Southeast Asians, South Asians, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders that we claim, which means we should be creating space for them to be uplifted as well. In the context of COVID-19 and even this conversation today, I'll be honest, we've been navigating this conversation of anti-Asian hate, stop API hate, And many Pacific Islander organizations and organizers have made the point that while they're very much in support and in solidarity with fighting this racism, they are not necessarily the ones being impacted directly by it. And so we've made an intentional effort to say Asian American hate versus AAPI hate or some form of that. And so it's, I think it's one of those things where the language of inclusion doesn't quite match up with the actual practice. And so it's one thing we're really encouraging folks to think about.
And I also wanted to just kind of go back in history a little bit and just say that, what Greg is saying is true in the sense that we've, AAPI, communities have experienced anti-Asian hate in throughout history, right? Throughout history, and it has reached these points of violence over and over and over and over and over again. Let's not forget the people who have passed away. Let's not forget Vincent Chin. Let's not forget, Danny. Let's not forget like all of the people who have paid with their lives, for. Sorry. The model minority myth is rooted actually in white supremacy. I note this because the fact of the matter is it was first coined by actually the New York Times. It was first coined by the New York Times, and it led to, I kid you not, 1991 LA riots. It led to the riots, and then it led to death. And so just talking about what it means and why it exists is very important. I think that the reason, Greg is right. It was used to divide our communities. It was also used to divide our communities from other communities. And it was also used to pit communities against one another in a very divisive way. The reason why it was coined was so that people would fight over the same piece of pie instead of, building a coalition amongst communities to basically fight for more pie or in, the fear for their white supremacy for all the pie, right? And I think that one of the things that is so important is also to recognize how much the model minority myth and the stereotype prevents people from actually gaining access to benefits, and also to be able to get access to services, because the model minority myth is used all of the time to say that things are okay for East Asians, for all Asian Americans, and it hides the poverty, the deep poverty that is actually within our communities. In New York City and in New York State, Asian Americans are actually the most impoverished group, the most impoverished ethnic group in the entire state and in the entire city. In our city, 1 in 4 Asian Americans lives in poverty. And when I say city, I'm saying New York City, where we have a large amount of people, but 1 in 4 Asian Americans lives in poverty. And that poverty is hidden when it comes to not disaggregating data, when it comes to saying that, we're model minorities and that actually silences our groups as well. It silences our communities as well. And it makes it so that, folks feel like, oh, we're supposed to be doing well, or we don't have to give resources to Asian Americans. In our New York State budget, this is a sore spot for myself because until I was elected, there was $0 for Asian Americans in our New York State budget, where we make up over 10% of our state's population. And when I finally was able to get some dollars for our organizations, the amount is nothing. It's about $300,000. And that's the first time that we've ever had any money for our Asian American organizations. And this is where we see how much harm this has caused us, how much the model minority stereotype will continue to harm us. And I will tell you that the other flip side of the model minority myth isn't just the lack of access and the lack of services that people will deny us because it's invisibilizing, right? But also there's the perpetual foreigner syndrome. So for for folks who don't understand what the perpetual foreigner syndrome is, it's that we're always the other. We're always not American enough. We're always not part of. We're not belonging, and that's another excuse to not include us in benefits, include us in access. And so it's very clear that these stereotypes obviously don't actually come from our communities, but are given to us as labels, and are used over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in every single one of the reasons why somebody is to attack us or hurt us or invisibilize us or erase us. And I also would be very, very, not speaking my mind when if I don't address the fact that, there's also the fact that what Christian said was very true. What Christian Nunes was saying was very true, that there is this hypersexualization of Asian women, and that has caused invisibilization because it causes objectification, which makes it so that we are dehumanized, and then therefore violence could be perpetrated on us without anybody caring. So just wanted to put that out there, and that having been one of the biggest reasons, I think, talking about the humanization and asking and begging for people to understand that we are actually human too. And that's really disgusting that we have to even ask that. And that's one of the biggest things that we're talking about today, and what we're seeing in real time in our media right now, without having the names or the loved ones or the stories of the people who were murdered.
Thank you, Yulin. I also want to welcome John Yang. John, we already introduced you. So the question right now for all the panelists is, how does the model minority trope hurt the APIA community and contribute to some of the escalating tensions we are now seeing?
Yeah, and I think Yulin already addressed it. I'm sure Greg addressed it. Welcome, everyone. I'm sorry I was late. But it makes us both invisible and a monolith. It makes us invisible because people just see us as this other, as she described. And they see us just as a number or a thing rather than as humans, or rather as individuals. And the piece about being seen as a monolith is also very, very important. Because if you talk about the model minority myth, right, then it suggests that our community does well, our community doesn't need resources, and that if anything, it's used to perpetuate this notion that, and any troubles you have, you don't have it that bad. And so you guys have no right to be talking about the issues that you have. And that's just obviously true. If you, what we call disaggregate the data, yes, it is true that there are certain Asian Americans that are doing exceptionally well, but I always describe our community as a barbell. There, on one side, there is a group that does quite well, above the norm with respect to wealth, with respect to education, with respect to access. But on the other side, there's a population, a sizable population that does exceptionally poorly with respect to education, with respect to wealth, with respect to all of these normal indicia of success. And that population gets lost, right? And I don't know if this statistic was brought up, but one of the things that's interesting to note is over the past 50 years, we all recognize that our society has become further fractured in terms of those who have and those who have not. That wealth gap has increased. For the Asian American community, that wealth gap has increased the most. And that separation between those people that are doing well and those people that are not doing well is greater than ever. And so when you talk about the model minority myth, what happens? People always focus on the people doing well, and then they don't talk about the vulnerable. And what we saw in Atlanta yesterday was exactly an example of the vulnerable in our community. It was people that are struggling to get by. It was women. It was a community of immigrants. These are people that are in a position that they don't have power, they don't have access, and as a result, they are vulnerable to violence. Now, I know that the news reporting right now, it's unclear whether it is a hate crime. The thing I would want to say about that is, in some ways, I don't care what that classification is. What I care about right now is what our community is facing, and the fear, the anger, the frustration about not being seen, and making sure that people see what is happening and protect our community, and make sure that it's a mutual obligation to look out for each other and make sure that we see each other through in this time of real crisis.
Thank you, Greg. John, I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you this question, and I think it's important, so I'm going to come back to you. Your organization created a site to document hate crimes, harassment, and discrimination as a response to an increase to such incidents in the lead up to 2016. Why is this type of documentation so important, and how has it helped your legal advocacy?
It's been incredibly important because, again, it goes to the visibility piece. You know, the reality is, there are many people that say, well, is this really a thing? And now I appreciate what you said about this website. It is a collector of stories. It is a collector of some data. But the reality is, this is just a tip of the iceberg about what we're seeing. There's another organization, California, called Stop API Hate, that's done a wonderful job of also collecting data. They've collected over 3,800 attacks against Asian Americans in this past year. Our site has collected a smaller number than that, but also very consistent in the sense that what we are seeing is a clear level of hate. And what we are able to do with these websites is to tell the stories of the victims, and give them a place to have a voice, and then to use their voice and really amplify that to give power to our community. Because I always say that in order to move policy, you need two things. You need data, because some people believe in data, but then you need those human stories as well, because you need both the mind and the heart. And so what these websites do, and why we encourage people to report to them, is that it gives us the stories to appeal to the heart. It also, frankly, has been empowering. I've had many people that I've seen their stories, and they just appreciate the fact that they can tell their stories. Because again, it gives them some sense of agency to what has happened to them, some place to say, this was real. And the fact that I can document it shows to people that this is real. So I don't want to take that piece away from people as well.
Thank you, John. There's another question for all the panelists, and we'll start with you, Greg, and give John a little break. As grassroots activists, how can now members and supporters be allies in your effort? Are there specific pieces of legislation that we can get behind?
Thank you. I'll leave it to John to answer about specific legislation. I want to say that, you know, in terms of getting engaged, one, having events like this, and it sounds so simple, but honestly, we have found that over the last year, there's been interest in supporting the Asian American community during this time, but certainly over the last 36 hours, there's been an outpouring of support. And really, it is an opportunity to have everybody move forward in the conversation about who we are as a community. A lot of what we've talked about is truly important. And I think if every member of your organization and network can start to push that conversation as well, that's when we start to make progress. And there has to be an understanding, and it was talked about earlier, that there's this shared experience in terms of our navigation of racism, right? Asian American racism is not new. All communities of colors navigate it, and it takes that understanding to maybe find that common ground that sometimes has been missing. And that's truly my hope, is that we can come together and we can have other validators outside of our community start to say, you know what, no, this is not right. Or, you know what, Asian Americans are far more diverse than we give them credit for. And we should start recognizing the underrepresented communities in that broader community. That is oftentimes the missing piece in this, because when you engage with decision makers, you're finding similar challenges in terms of them not truly understanding who we are as a community. And so we need as much help as we can get in terms of really rewriting that narrative.
Thank you. Yulene?
I mean, I'll just echo Greg on that. He was very, very thorough, and also John. You know, thank you. I mean, I can't speak enough for the fact that, you know, the data, the stories that need to be told are so key. You know, I'll just put that again out there, but also, let's make sure that we are also providing space. I think that providing space is so important, and making sure that we have spaces like this one that Christian is providing for us also, and with with also just a safety that we can um, you know actually listen to one another and speak up to one another, and be able to have a place where we can grieve too. And I think that I really appreciate that was happenstance, but I really appreciate the space you created today.
Thank you, Yulene. John?
Piggybacking off of that, I very much appreciate that right now, and this was fortuitous, obviously, that this was scheduled for tonight. You're also seeing us in an aftershock in this moment where we are grieving. And so we really appreciate all of you giving space to do that, giving us the patience to do that as we work through some of this literally online. But then we also, I'll admit, I have to focus on what the solutions look like, right? And when you ask about what legislation we could look at, well, there's certainly pieces. There's what's called the Jabbar No Hate Act. Grace Meng has a bill on COVID-19 hate crimes. Both of those can help move some of the conversation around getting better data, getting a better understanding of what's going on. But to be honest, this is one of those spaces that policies, legislation only have certain limits. We could also talk about how the federal government could better resource community-based groups with respect to language access, with respect to cultural competency. But again, that only goes so far. What all of us need to do more generally is think about how we educate each other through spaces like this, and have those courageous conversations. Especially with respect to the Atlanta attacks, we need to layer in, what it means to be a woman, right, and the vulnerability around that, because that clearly was at play here. We also need to layer in what racism means generally in America. We saw that last summer, and that has to be part of the conversation. The experiences that each of us have are unique, but we are better if we come together to talk about it candidly, frankly. Sometimes it will be uncomfortable, but that's okay. That's okay. That's how we will move forward together in this time.
And I just wanted to piggyback on that a little bit on the legislation piece. And I'm sorry to kind of bust in on this, but I also wanted to just note that, what John just said was so key. Also on every single level of government, there needs to be more access, more funding. And we've been cut out from jump, right? From everything. And I will also say that we have not talked about the gig economy. We haven't talked about what that's like to be, person who who has very little representation when it comes to being within the gig economy, right? When you're a food delivery person, and all of the things that you experience in New York as a food delivery person, and then as a person who's in the nail salon industry, or in the massage parlor industry, or in in any kind of like food truck industry. All of these folks are gig economy folks. And in New York, we're trying to fund excluded workers. We're trying to make sure that folks are able to, get certain benefits. I personally feel like it's so important to make sure that, we do have legislation. We do have certain things that are going to, from the big things like the excluded workers fund, all the way to the small things, like the big things like data disaggregation is so important, but also to the small things of making sure that we're also stopping robocalls that prey on our seniors, that make it so that we're also making it so that folks have fair lending, right? Because there's redlining that happens to particular individuals. Most people don't realize that premiums for car insurance are often determined on credit score, right? Credit score and credit history are such huge deals, but what is one thing that immigrants don't have? It's a credit history. You have to be in the country for over 7 years before you even have a little bit of credit history. And then your credit score is also affected by how you use credit. And that is culturally not something that, many Asian American cultures use, right? I was talking to my friend Fu Li, who's a Hmong representative out of Minnesota. And we were just talking about how difficult it is to help our communities to be able to access credit, and how to get access to certain funds, et cetera. And how unfair it is, because just because we are taught, it's like literally like told us to us as kids, like, live within your means, like don't use a penny outside, and like don't get a credit card, and then you realize later on you can't even buy a house or a car or anything, like if you don't have a credit, it's just like all of the stuff that makes it so that you can't even get car insurance. People can't, you have higher premiums if you're Asian American, or if you're African American, or if you're Native, every single category is just like, it's a system that's literally designed, again, to make it so that particular communities pay more and are hurt more by the process, right? And so I think that it's just so important that we are actually going from thing to thing to thing, redesigning that system, like dismantling the racist parts of it, and then making sure that we have something that works for all of us. And that's like the legislation, I think, that will help us to get more access, more ability to be able to speak up, and more representation at the table.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for this important conversation. I'm sure our participants have many questions for you today. So we will now open up the discussion. Please submit your questions for our panelists in the Q&A box for the moderators to read. Let's see here. Our first question is from Sunita Sharabi. I'm really butchering the name here, sorry. Contributing editor of Ethnic Media Services. Question for Greg. The Atlanta police released the audio of the 911 call. It was clear the dispatcher did not understand the caller and missed the gravity of the situation on both the calls made. Is APIA calling for more interpreters at the dispatch centers? Yesterday's event certainly highlighted that need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a perfect illustration of the structural barriers that we're all talking about, right? I don't think it is the fault of the dispatcher for the language barrier, but it is the fault of the government for not providing more resources to bypass those language barriers. John mentioned the need for language access. It's not just dispatchers, it's across the government, because there's federal programs in all aspects of life that our communities simply cannot access because it is not accessible in a language that they understand. And so APIA, through John's organization and our other members, are looking at literally every aspect of policy where language access could be important. So this is certainly within the context of civil rights, but health equity, education equity, housing, I mean, all of the things really do apply in this case. And so I do appreciate the question. And I think it's just a great opportunity to really dive into that, a real life example of what language access could mean for our community.
Put a finer point on it, if I might. Going to my paradigm of the data and stories, that's a story. The data is about 1/3 of the Asian American population is limited English proficient. And what that means is 1/3 of our population has difficulty navigating in English. And let's face it, some of these things, even for a native English speaker, it's hard to navigate. If you're talking about a PPP loan, if you're talking about how to sign up for a COVID vaccination online, it's hard enough for English speaking speakers. I know, I mean, I've tried to do that for my mother. So just imagine what that's like for an immigrant that doesn't speak English or doesn't speak English well. So that's data behind the stories that Greg is telling about why language access, cultural competence is so important.
Yulene, would you like to add anything?
I mean, as an immigrant kid myself, I was my parents' first translator. I will say that that's something that many of us have those stories about. But I was I was calling out for our governor to make sure that there's language access just for the vaccinations. And we were calling out for the same thing when it was the testing. And we were calling out for the same thing when it was even just, getting access to care. And we were calling out for the same thing when it was just even our New York State websites. It's on repeat, and it's really, really atrocious, the lack of access that just having that language barrier is. And I thank Greg for and his organization for calling out what is missing within the government, right? And it is on the government. It is 100% on the government, and it is on the fact that they never thought about that, because we don't have representation at the table. It makes it so that there isn't that policy thought. There isn't that diversity of thinking when it comes to making the policy for these layered issues that we're always dealing with day to day to day to day. And it wasn't even until, again, it's not until I was in office when, people were even questioning whether or not, oh, hey, Asian Americans should probably have some kind of amount in, defense funds when it comes to, immigration. Oh my gosh, we're the largest growing undocumented community in the entire nation. And yet, they never thought that that might be an issue when we had maybe some need for language access. Again, AAJC was one of the most vocal, most active when it came to that resource on the national level. It's so difficult. And it's just so much of for us who live it every day, it's a question that we ask every time when we enter a room. And it's also, when it comes to policy, it's so easy to just ask that question, right? Well, how will we have language access? What is the website going to look like? How is the phone going to be picked up? How are people going to answer that? We ask it all the time, but what happens when we're not in the room? The questions never get asked. And that's where things go missing. And again and again and again and again, when it comes to census, when it comes to everything, when it comes to voting, when it comes to voting access, when it comes to calls, when it comes to 911, when it comes to, accessing food, when it comes to all of these things, if you don't have the people at the table who are going to help to reach the communities that need to be reached, you're not going to have the actual competence within your policy to be able to reach those people. So just wanted to put that there.
Wonderful. Next question is from May Sachil. Do any of you know if there are any resources from the pandemic relief to help states outreach this information to their Asian communities? It would be very helpful if there was a central piece for each state to report these hate crimes. I feel having data would be important. It is also important to have an outlet specifically for this so it is more organized and easier to track. Who would like to start that?
John, go!
Thanks, Julian. The reality is no, it's very fractured right now. And that's why, one thing is this Jabbar Hire No Hate Act that I've talked about, Grace Meng's legislation, does attempt to start to standardize that. But ultimately, we do need legislative power. We need advocacy at the state level, Yulene, to also make that happen. Because what happens, if you want to think about the physical structure, is it gets reported to your local police department or your local prosecutor. It gets reported to your local healthcare facilities. And then that reporting gets rolled up, so to speak, to the federal level, right? And the federal level absolutely can and should be doing more to provide grants to the local level to make sure that that reporting happens. But the reality is that the local governments themselves will need to resource that. And again, resource it in a way that is linguistically capable and culturally competent. So, it's a bigger piece. It's a bigger piece. I'm going to take this opportunity, recognizing that we have limited time, to answer one other question I see in there that I think is important, which is what can people do at this moment? And there's two things that I would offer. One is very simple, which is for those of you that have Asian American neighbors, friends and family, just check in with them, please. Because, I can almost guarantee you that they are feeling these things. And to have someone echo that to them and say, hey, I hear you, I see you, is going to be extremely meaningful. I promise you that. Number two is think about opportunities that you can show up. One thing that we do is what's called bystander intervention training, so that we give people, when they see an act of hate, to respond in an appropriate manner to de-escalate the situation. Again, we don't want people to be superheroes and jumping in and trying to break things up or anything, but there's just so many little things that you can do to reduce that mental trauma, reduce that trauma for the victim. And so looking for places like that to get yourself educated about how to be a good upstander in those situations is something that I would encourage people to do. and then just continue in these types of conversations, learn more. And so that way you are in a position that you can challenge racism in an appropriate manner wherever you see it, because you are armed with the facts, you are armed with the history, and you could talk about it in a manner that resonates.
Yes, I did actually attend the Hollaback bystander training. It was excellent. Thank you. Does anyone, if Greg or Yulene, do you have anything to add? Or should we just move on? Okay.
I guess the one thing I will add, one thing is that the federal government did not provide. I mean, if what we're fighting for is the thing that we are trying to get, but federal government has not provided meaningful funding for to stop API hate.
Well, hopefully now, especially with what happened in Atlanta, it will go through. Next question from Jack Hanna. What strategies do you think are being successfully employed and those that are not that should be employed to develop political coalitions with other communities of color and economically disadvantaged ethnics to dismantle systemic racism?
So I'll take a quick stab at this. I think it starts with a little bit of honesty, especially within the broader Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community. I said earlier that we need validators, from outside of our communities to help us fight this fight. And I genuinely believe we bear a responsibility to show up for other communities of color and others that are navigating a racist and, sexist system that we've created. And so, if we're being honest, our community is not always all the way there, right? And we need to be honest with ourselves and challenge ourselves to be more receptive to these difficult conversations that John alluded to. Coalition building is tough. I mean, it's what we try to do every single day. And I think it starts with recognizing common ground, but it also begins with an offering, right? You have to be willing to, offer someone show them a willingness to work together. And so I feel as though everyone has been impacted by this virus, and everybody to some extent has felt like their community has been overlooked. And the truth is we all have. And so I think we have to start there and recognize there is a shared struggle that if we can name and really lean into together, I think we're all better for it.
John or Yulene, would you like to add to that? No? Okay.
Quick thing I would just add is to always think about this. There are little things you can do. Just start with your own book club. When you're talking about coalition building, sometimes people think, oh my gosh, that sounds hard, that sounds big. Just think about your own book club, or you think about your PTA, sort of engaging in that way. Because some of those retail conversations are frankly more important than these conversations that we are having at the so-called national level. Certainly those retail conversations could lead to quicker change than getting legislation passed.
Great.
One of the best ways to organize, I will also say, is karaoke. That was an Uncle Bob Santos legendary move. So we always love to karaoke, and also one of the reasons why I was a karaoke host.
Very nice. Greg, did you want to add? No, okay. Well, we are at the end, so thank you all very much for being here today and sharing your time with us. I know that we are all inspired to educate ourselves even more and take action to support the efforts of the organization we heard from today. Some immediate steps we can take are, as John mentioned, supporting the Jabara Heya No Hate Act to fight against hate crimes, harassment, and discrimination of people of color, including Asian Americans. Support the No Ban Act in order to end racial and religious profiling of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, and otherwise by challenging Islamophobia. Challenging racial and religious profiling generally, and support enforcement and enhancement of anti-discrimination laws. Visiting and encouraging others to visit AAJC's website, www.standagainsthatred.org, to better understand the climate Asian American communities are living in and encourage individuals with stories to share and to submit their experiences. More information on these action steps will be available on now.org. Thank you so much, panelists, and all of you for joining us today. As we offer our condolences and support to the grieving families and communities in Atlanta, we look forward to continuing these important conversations in the days ahead and stopping these vicious and racist attacks once and for all. Thank you so much. Bye now.